My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old. 3 weeks before my wedding, my mother stood in my kitchen and told me, calmly, like she was reading off a grocery list, that my father wasn't going to walk me down the aisle. "He's walking your sister at her vow renewal that same weekend," she said. "You understand. Family comes first." I didn't understand. Not then. What I didn't know, what none of them knew, was that by the time I found out what they'd actually planned for my wedding day, I would already own the one thing that mattered more to my family than I ever had. I grew up in Ohio, the older of 2 daughters. My sister Melissa is 2 years younger than me, and for as long as I can remember, she was the daughter my parents understood. She liked the things they liked. She stayed close to home. She called every Sunday. I was the one who left. At 18, I got a scholarship to a university 4 hours away, studying supply chain logistics, not exactly a glamorous major, but I loved it. I loved systems. I loved figuring out how to make something that was broken run smoothly again. My father used to joke that I'd been born wanting to reorganize the pantry. After college, I took a job with a regional freight company, then a logistics firm, then eventually landed at a mid-sized manufacturing company where I quietly worked my way up over 11 years. I wasn't flashy about it. I didn't post updates. I just worked. My parents never really asked about my job beyond housework. Melissa's updates, a new boyfriend, a new apartment, a promotion to assistant manager at a boutique, got 20 minutes at Sunday dinner. Mine got a nod and a change of subject. I used to tell myself that was just how our family talked. Some people are talkers. Some people aren't. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I was wrong about that, but it would take years for me to understand how wrong. I met Daniel at a logistics conference in Chicago, of all places. He worked on the client side. His family owned a mid-sized industrial real estate company, warehouses, and distribution centers mostly, spread across 3 states. He wasn't the type to lead with that. I found out what his family did for a living on our 4th date, almost by accident, when he mentioned needing to leave early for a call with a tenant about a lease renewal. I liked him because he listened the way I listen, fully, like the conversation in front of him was the only thing happening in the world. His father, Robert, was the same way. I met Robert about 4 months into dating Daniel, at a dinner that was supposed to be casual and ended up lasting 3.5 hours because none of us wanted to stop talking. Robert asked me questions nobody in my own family had asked me in over a decade. What did I actually do all day? What made a good warehouse routing system? Why did I care about it? He listened to my answers like they mattered. I didn't tell my parents about Daniel for almost a year. Not because I was hiding him, because every time I tried to bring him up, the conversation would drift back to Melissa within 2 minutes, and eventually I stopped trying. When I finally did introduce them at a family barbecue, my mother's first comment to me privately afterward was, "He seems nice. A little quiet, don't you think? Melissa's Tyler is so much more outgoing." Daniel proposed on a Tuesday, in our kitchen, no grand gesture, just him getting down on one knee while I was mid-sentence about a grocery list. It was perfect. It was us. I called my mother that night, genuinely excited, expecting, I don't know what I was expecting. Something. "Oh, honey, that's nice," she said. Then, "Did I tell you Melissa and Tyler are doing a vow renewal for their 10th anniversary? Same month as you, actually. What a coincidence." I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, feeling something settle in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Wedding planning with my mother was, from the start, less about my wedding and more about how my wedding related to Melissa's vow renewal. Every time I mentioned a detail, the venue, the dress, the guest list, my mother would find a way to connect it back. "Melissa's doing white peonies too, did you know that? You two are just alike." "We are not alike." We have never been alike. But I let it go, because that's what I always did. The real tension started when I asked my father if he'd walk me down the aisle. He said yes immediately, and for about 6 weeks, I actually believed that part of the day was settled. I'd pictured it 100 times, the two of us at the top of the aisle, him squeezing my hand the way he used to when I was small and scared of thunderstorms. At that moment, I thought the worst thing my family could do was disappoint me. I was wrong. 3 weeks before the wedding, I found out the truth by accident, in a family group chat I almost never opened. My mother had sent a scheduling reminder to my aunts and cousins for Melissa's vow renewal. Buried in the middle of the message, between the ceremony time and the caterer's name, was one line: Dad walks Melissa down at 3 p.m., right after the toast. Nobody had told me. Nobody had asked me. It had already been decided, discussed, and scheduled with extended family, before my own father had said a single word to me about it. I called him directly. My hands were shaking, though my voice, somehow, wasn't. Dad, I said, did you already decide you weren't walking me? There was a pause long enough that I knew the answer before he gave it. Your mother thought it would be easier this way, he said. Easier. Not impossible. Not conflicting. Easier. That word sat with me for days. My father hadn't been backed into an impossible choice by scheduling. He had simply agreed, quietly, to let someone else decide for him, and then let me find out from a group chat meant for people who weren't even his daughter. 3 days later, my mother called and asked if she could come by. She never just came by. I knew something was off the second she sat down at my kitchen table without taking her coat off, though by then, I already knew what she was going to say. Your father can't walk you down the aisle, she said. I asked why. Melissa and Tyler moved their vow renewal to the same weekend as your wedding. There was a scheduling conflict with the venue, and it was really the only date that worked for them. Your father is walking Melissa at hers. It's a special day for her too, Claire. You understand. I did not understand. I asked why they couldn't push the vow renewal. It wasn't even a wedding, it was a celebration of an anniversary that had already happened. There was no legal ceremony, no license, nothing time-sensitive about it at all. My wedding had a date. A venue. 140 guests. Vendors already paid. My mother's answer was the same sentence, rearranged: family comes first, Claire. This is important to your sister. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't rage. It was something quieter and colder. It was the specific, sinking recognition of a pattern I had spent my whole life pretending not to see, suddenly refusing to be ignored anymore. I didn't argue with her. I didn't cry in front of her. I just said okay, and let her leave. That night, I told Daniel what happened. He was furious in a way I rarely saw from him, not loud, but sharp, focused. You don't have to have anyone walk you, he said. You can walk in with me from the start. Or with my dad, if you want. He already thinks of you like. He stopped himself, unsure if that was his to offer. I told him I needed a few days to think. What I didn't tell Daniel, what I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet, was that this wasn't really about who walked me down an aisle. It was about a lifetime of being quietly deprioritized, dressed up as practicality. My mother's phone call wasn't an isolated incident. It was the latest entry in a ledger I'd been keeping without realizing it, going back to childhood recitals my parents left early for Melissa's soccer games, birthday dinners where the conversation was 90% about her life, a college graduation my parents arrived 40 minutes late to because Melissa needed help picking out an outfit for a date. None of these things, on their own, were unforgivable. That's what made them so effective. Each one was small enough to swallow. It was only when I lined them all up, one after another, that I could see the shape of the thing. I decided I wasn't going to fight my parents on this. I wasn't going to beg my father to change his mind, or guilt my mother into reconsidering. I had done that dance my whole life, and it never worked, because the imbalance wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a preference. You cannot argue someone out of a preference. so I made a different decision. I would let them do exactly what they wanted to do. And I would build my wedding day around the family that actually showed up for me. The week before the wedding, my mother called twice, each time with a slightly different version of events for me to relay to guests, in case anyone asked why my father wasn't walking me. The first version was a family conflict. The second version, when I pushed back gently, was your father has a bad knee, it's really not a big deal. I didn't correct either version. I let her have her story. What she didn't know was that Robert, Daniel's father, had asked me, quietly, over dinner 2 weeks earlier, whether I had someone to walk me down the aisle. I told him the situation honestly. I wasn't looking for him to solve anything. I just told him because he'd asked, and because at that point, talking to him felt easier than talking to my own parents. Robert didn't say much in that moment. He just nodded slowly and said, "Well, if you'd ever want it, I'd be honored." No pressure at all. I didn't say yes right away. It felt strange, asking my future father-in-law to stand in a role I still, somewhere underneath all the hurt, wanted my own father to fill. But as the days went on and my father made no move to call me himself, not once, in 3 weeks, did he personally bring up the change, letting my mother do all the talking on his behalf, I understood something had already been decided, by him, long before that kitchen table conversation. 4 days before the wedding, I called Robert and asked if the offer still stood. He answered before I even finished the sentence. "Absolutely, Claire. Absolutely." My wedding venue was a restored event space in a converted warehouse just outside the city, exposed brick, big windows, high ceilings, the kind of place that photographs beautifully without needing much decoration. I'd fallen in love with it the moment I walked in, 8 months before the wedding, and put down the deposit that same week. I never asked who owned the building. It didn't occur to me. I booked it through an events coordinator, signed a standard contract, paid the deposits, and that was that. It wasn't until about 6 weeks before the wedding, when Daniel and I were finalizing table assignments with his father over dinner, that Robert asked, almost offhand, which venue we'd chosen. I told him the name. He went quiet for a second, then smiled in a way I didn't understand yet. "Small world," he said. I asked what he meant. "That building's ours," he said. "We bought it 4 years ago, before it was renovated. Leased it out to the events company that runs it now." I sat there for a moment, trying to process the coincidence. Out of every venue in the city, I'd chosen, completely independently, months before I even knew Robert well, a building his family owned. Daniel started laughing. "You didn't know that? Dad, did you seriously not say anything when she booked it?" Robert shrugged. "Didn't want to make her feel like she owed us anything by choosing it. It's a good venue on its own merits. I wasn't going to bring it up unless it came up naturally." That was Robert, in one sentence. He never made anything about leverage. He just quietly held information and let people arrive at things in their own time. I didn't think much more about it in that moment. It felt like a nice piece of trivia, nothing more. I had no idea it would matter in a matter of weeks, that the building my parents were about to walk into, ready to make a statement about who mattered and who didn't, belonged to the family I was marrying into. The night before the wedding, my mother called one more time. I almost didn't pick up. "I just want you to know," she said, "your father feels terrible about all this." I asked her, plainly, if he felt terrible enough to call me himself. There was a pause. "He's not good with that kind of thing, Claire. You know how he is." I didn't know how he was. He'd never once, in my entire life, been too uncomfortable to have a difficult conversation with Melissa. He negotiated her lease with her landlord when she was 23. He sat with her for 4 hours when she and Tyler almost broke up before their actual wedding. Not good with that kind of thing had always, somehow, only applied to me. I told my mother I understood, and that I hoped the vow renewal went well. I meant it. I wasn't angry at Melissa, I never had been. This was never about her. It was about a pattern that ran through my parents, one that had picked its favorite a long time ago and never really wavered since. I hung up the phone and sat on my bed for a long time. Daniel found me there. He didn't ask if I was okay, he already knew I wasn't, not entirely. He just sat down next to me and said, "Tomorrow isn't about them." It never was. I believed him. I still had to get through the day to prove it to myself. The morning of my wedding, I got a text from Melissa. Not a call, a text. "Hope your day is nice. We're getting ready over here too, it's a lot, lol. See you at Thanksgiving probably." She wasn't coming. I already knew that. She'd told me 2 months earlier that the timing conflict meant she'd be at her own event. What stung wasn't her absence. It was the tone. A lot, lol. As if the two events were equivalent inconveniences, rather than one being my wedding day and the other a party for an anniversary that had already happened 3 separate times before, without needing a renewal. I put the phone down and let my bridesmaids finish my hair. My father texted at 9:47 a.m., "Have a great day, sweetheart." That was the entire message. No call. No, "I wish I could be there." No acknowledgement, even implicit, of what he was choosing not to do. I remember looking at that text and feeling, for the first time in the entire process, not sad, but clear. Something in me finished deciding something. Robert walked me down the aisle. I want to describe this moment carefully, because it's the part of the day I think about the most. He didn't try to fill space or make it about himself. He simply offered his arm at the top of the aisle, looked at me, and said quietly, "Whenever you're ready." I nodded, and we walked. Halfway down, I caught Daniel's face. He wasn't looking at the crowd or the flowers or anything else. He was just watching me and his father walk together, and I saw something in his expression that I can only describe as quiet pride, for both of us. 80 guests were there. My extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins on both sides, filled about a third of the room. My parents were conspicuously absent from that count, and I noticed, standing at the altar, more than one relative glancing toward the empty seats reserved for them, then glancing at each other. I found out later, from my Aunt Patricia, what my mother had told people who asked. Not, "He has a bad knee." Not, "Family conflict." What she'd actually said, to at least a dozen guests over the preceding weeks, was, "Claire understood that we needed to prioritize Melissa's event." She was very mature about it. She hadn't told people we'd cancelled his role reluctantly. She'd told people I had graciously stepped aside, recast the entire situation as my choice, my maturity, my accommodation. As if I'd offered up my own father's presence at my wedding as some kind of gift to my sister. I didn't know this during the ceremony. I found out 3 days later. But I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it tells you everything about how my family operated. It wasn't enough to deprioritize me. They needed the story of it to make me look generous for accepting it. The reception was, by every account except one, the best day of my life up to that point. Robert gave a toast. He didn't make it about the absence of my parents, he made it about Daniel, about me, about the family we were building. But there was one line that landed differently than he probably intended, given what he knew and what most of the room didn't. "Claire found her way into this family," he said, raising his glass, "the same way she found her way into everything else in her life, quietly, and completely on her own terms. We're lucky to have her." A few relatives from my side of the family exchanged glances at that. I think some of them understood exactly what he meant. Near the end of the night, my Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, the one person in my extended family who had never once treated me and Melissa differently, pulled me aside. "Your mother told everyone you asked Robert to walk you," she said. "That it was some kind of second choice because your dad had a schedule thing with the venue." I didn't say anything at the time, but I want you to know I know that's not what happened. "Your father chose this." I told her the truth, plainly. She nodded slowly. "I always wondered why you got so quiet around this family," she said. "I think I understand now. The Monday after my wedding, my mother called to debrief, as she called it, asking about the venue, the dress, whether people liked the food. She didn't ask about Robert walking me. She acted, for the entire 20-minute call, as if that detail simply hadn't happened, or didn't matter enough to mention. I let her talk for a while. Then I asked her directly, "Did you tell people I chose to let Dad go to Melissa's event? That I was being mature about it?" There was a pause. "I don't remember exactly what I said, Claire. I might have said something like that. It's basically what happened, isn't it?" "No," I said. "It's not. Dad chose not to come. You told people I offered him up." Another pause, longer. "I don't see why this is such a big deal. Your wedding still happened. Everyone had a great time. You're being a little sensitive about this." I didn't argue with her. I'd learned, over 3 decades, that arguing with my mother about how she characterized things never once resulted in her admitting anything. What I said instead was simple. "I need some space for a while. I'll reach out when I'm ready." She didn't understand what some space would come to mean. Neither did I, fully, not yet. Over the following months, something shifted in my relationship with my parents that I didn't orchestrate as a plan. It happened more organically than that. I simply stopped performing the emotional labor I'd always performed. I stopped being the one who called first. I stopped smoothing over tension at family gatherings. I stopped explaining myself. At first, my mother called more often, almost as if testing whether the shift was real. Then, when I remained warm but distant, polite, present for major holidays, but no longer chasing closeness that had never been reciprocated, the calls slowed to their old rhythm. Occasional. Brief. Usually about Melissa. I didn't tell my parents anything about Daniel's family's business in the months following the wedding. It wasn't a secret I was keeping strategically, it genuinely didn't come up, because we barely spoke, and when we did, the conversation stayed shallow by mutual, unspoken agreement. What changed things wasn't a plan I made. It was an announcement Daniel's family made, about 18 months after our wedding, that had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with what came next. Robert's company had been quietly acquiring properties for years, warehouses, distribution centers, light industrial space, mostly in secondary markets that hadn't yet caught the attention of larger investors. 2 years after our wedding, that strategy paid off in a way that made regional business news. The company completed a deal that tripled its property portfolio, anchored by a new logistics hub that would service several major retailers in the area. Daniel had been working alongside his father for years, learning the business from the ground up, and by that point, he'd taken on a genuine leadership role, not handed to him, but earned through the same kind of quiet, sustained work that had always defined how his family operated. And me, somewhere in those 2 years, without any grand announcement, I had moved from my old logistics job into a director-level role at Robert's company, overseeing distribution operations for the newly expanded portfolio. It wasn't nepotism, not really, though I understand why anyone hearing this from the outside might assume that. Robert had watched me work for years before ever offering me anything, and when he finally did, it was based on a portfolio of ideas I'd been quietly developing about warehouse routing efficiency, ideas nobody in my own family had ever asked to hear about, that turned out to be worth quite a lot of money to a company that operated exactly the kind of properties those ideas applied to. None of this had happened out of spite, or as some kind of engineered revenge. It had happened because I was good at my job, and because I'd married into a family that actually paid attention to what I was good at. But it did mean something had changed. And my parents had no idea. About 2.5 years after my wedding, Melissa and Tyler's boutique, the one Melissa managed, the one my parents had celebrated at every Sunday dinner for a decade, started struggling. Rent increases, a lease renewal that came in far higher than projected, foot traffic declining as the shopping center around it lost anchor tenants. I learned about this the way I learned most things about my family now, second-hand, filtered, months delayed. My mother called, this time not to debrief a wedding but to ask, carefully, cautiously, whether Daniel's family did anything with commercial leasing. She'd apparently learned, through a cousin, that Daniel's family was in real estate, and was hoping there might be some flexibility available for Melissa's shop. I told her I'd ask. I did ask, not because I felt obligated to fix anything for Melissa, who had never asked me for anything directly in her life, let alone acknowledge the pattern our parents had built between us, but because Robert, when I mentioned it, was genuinely curious about the property in question. It turned out to be owned by a smaller landlord his company had been in early conversations with about a potential portfolio acquisition. Robert looked into it. The numbers, as it turned out, didn't work, not because of any grudge, but because the location itself was declining. The lease terms Melissa and Tyler had signed were unfavorable from the start, and no amount of goodwill was going to fix a shopping center losing its foot traffic. Robert told me this plainly, the way he told me everything, and I relayed it to my mother the same way. There's nothing that can be done, I told her. It's not personal. The location isn't sustainable long-term regardless of who owns the lease. My mother's response surprised me, even after everything. Can't you just talk to them? You work there now, don't you? Can't you ask them to make an exception? I told her, gently but clearly, that I wasn't going to ask my employer, my husband's family's company, to make a business decision that didn't make financial sense, in order to bail out a lease Melissa had signed without consulting anyone. There was a long silence on the phone. I see, my mother said, in a tone I recognized instantly, because it was the same tone she'd used my entire childhood whenever I failed to do what was expected of me. I just thought family helps family. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said, quietly, it does. I'm just not sure our family has ever agreed on what that means. 3 years after that conversation, 5 years, total, after my wedding, my extended family organized a reunion, the kind that happens every few years, cousins and aunts and uncles gathering at a rented lake house for a long weekend. I almost didn't go. Daniel encouraged me to, gently, reminding me that Aunt Patricia would be there, and that I didn't have to spend the whole weekend near my parents if I didn't want to. I went. The weekend was largely fine, pleasant, even, in the specific way family gatherings can be pleasant when you've stopped expecting anything from the people who once disappointed you. My parents were there. Melissa and Tyler were there, their boutique long since closed, Tyler now working in insurance sales, Melissa doing part-time bookkeeping for a friend's small business. On the second night, sitting around a fire pit, my uncle, my mother's brother, a genial, straightforward man who'd always liked me, asked, in front of the group, how things were going with the big real estate company Daniel's family ran. He'd read something in the local business paper about the company's continued expansion and was curious. I gave a brief, honest answer, that things were going well, that we'd recently completed another acquisition, that my role had grown into overseeing operations across the full portfolio now. My mother, sitting a few chairs away, asked, almost too casually, what exactly do you do there, again? I don't think I've ever really understood. I told her, in plain terms, the scope of what I did, that I managed logistics operations across roughly 40 properties, oversaw a team of just under 30 people, and had led the integration process for every major acquisition over the past 3 years. There was a pause around the fire. My father, who had said very little to me all weekend beyond pleasantries, spoke up. That's a lot of responsibility, he said, sounding genuinely surprised. It is, I said. I've had it for a while now. I watched something shift in both of their faces, not guilt, exactly, not yet. Something closer to recalculation. The quiet arithmetic of two people realizing they'd spent years assuming a version of my life that no longer matched what was actually in front of them. I want to be honest about something here, because this isn't a story about a dramatic confrontation, and I think it's more true to say so than to invent one. My parents never sat me down and apologized for the wedding, for the pattern before it, for any of it. My mother never acknowledged what she'd told those 80 guests about my maturity in giving up my father's presence. My father never called to explain, even years later, why he chose Melissa's vow renewal, an event with no legal or ceremonial weight, over walking his own daughter down the aisle at her actual wedding. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways, more honest than an apology would have been. My parents simply began treating me differently, not out of remorse, I think, but out of a recalibrated understanding of where I now stood, relative to a family they respected, a family with resources, with standing in the community, with warehouses in 3 states. I noticed the invitations to family events start arriving earlier. I noticed my mother asking real questions about my work, not out of curiosity for its own sake, I suspected, but because my work had become impossible to ignore. I noticed my father, at Christmas the following year, telling a family friend, unprompted, that his daughter ran operations for one of the biggest logistics portfolios in the region, a sentence that would have been unimaginable from him 5 years earlier, when the honest version of that sentence would have been true, just unnoticed. I didn't correct him. I didn't need to. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say I got my revenge, that I built an empire specifically to make my parents regret what they did, that some part of me was working toward the moment they'd finally see my worth. That's not quite true, and I think it's important to say so honestly. I never built anything to prove a point to my parents. I built it because I loved the work, because Robert believed in ideas nobody else had bothered to ask me about, because Daniel and I built a life together that had room in it for both of us to grow. My parents' recalculation of my worth was a byproduct of that life, not its purpose. But I won't pretend the timing didn't feel like something. I won't pretend there wasn't a quiet, private satisfaction in watching my father describe, unprompted, the very career he'd never once asked about while I was building it, describing it now with a kind of pride that had been unavailable to me for 30 years, suddenly available the moment it came dressed in numbers large enough to be undeniable. I think about that a lot. About how much easier it would have been for both of us if that pride had simply been there all along, unconditional, the way it always was for Melissa. My relationship with my parents today is cordial. We see each other at holidays. We talk on the phone every few weeks, briefly. I don't think we'll ever have the relationship I once wanted with them, the one where I didn't have to earn attention, where support arrived before achievement rather than after it. I've made peace with that. Not the kind of peace that pretends nothing happened, but the kind that simply stops waiting for something that was never going to arrive in the form I once hoped for. My relationship with Melissa, oddly, has grown warmer over the years. Once the competition our parents built between us stopped being useful to anyone, we found we actually liked each other. She apologized once, unprompted, for the text she sent me the morning of my wedding. I told her she didn't need to. She wasn't the one who set the terms of our childhood. She was just the one who happened to benefit from them. Robert still tells the story of walking me down the aisle at every family gathering, usually the same way, quietly, without making it about himself. I was honored, he says, every time, like it's the first time he said it. It never gets old, hearing that from someone who chose to say it. If there's a lesson in all of this, and I've had years now to think about what it actually is, it isn't about revenge, and it isn't really about money or business or any of the things that ended up mattering in the specifics of my story. It's this: the people who are supposed to show up for you don't always do it when it counts, and no amount of quiet excellence on your part will guarantee that they eventually will. Sometimes they do come around, the way my parents eventually did, in their limited, imperfect way. Sometimes they don't, and you have to build a life that doesn't depend on their arrival at all. I didn't marry into a family with more resources to punish my parents. I married into a family that simply paid attention to what I was good at, to what I needed, to the small, specific ways I wanted to be seen. That was the actual difference. Not the warehouses. Not the portfolio. Just people who noticed. I think that's worth more than any single moment of vindication ever could be. If you've ever had to build your own version of family, the kind that shows up, the kind that notices, I'd love to hear about it. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.